We are welcoming Dr. Stephanie Rivera Berruz to act as our discussant in this wonderful panel / roundtable. And so Dr. Rivera Berruz is an assistant professor here at Marquette in the philosophy department, AA. She received what? Oh, sorry, associate. It's not a word. They put this here. It says assistant, so you're now an assistant, just so that it's consistent. She received her PhD in philosophy from SUNY Buffalo in 2014. She specializes in areas of Latin American and Caribbean philosophy, Latinx feminisms, philosophies of race, gender, and sexuality. She also has interest in phenomenology, existentialism, and value theory. Her research is interdisciplinary and explores historiography, social identity, and current political issues. She has published and co-edited anthology Comparative Studies in Asian and Latin American Philosophy since 2018, and her work has been featured in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Genealogy, Hypatia, and Inter-American Journal of Philosophy, and essays on philosophy. Nick wrote this. I'm reading what Nick wrote. I'm blaming Nick because I can. She's also authored several public-facing pieces through Medium that touch on contemporary social issues in the wake of COVID-19 and in the COVID-19 pandemic. She's generally a very nifty person. You should probably talk to her about it. She's had several very interesting invitations to speak at places like Harvard as well as Penn State. Without further ado, all power to Dr.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be in conversation with all of you. I hope this will be a really nice opportunity for us to bridge all of the things that were kind of discussed today, and then also open up for conversation. So I think what I'm gonna do first is just kind of pull out some threads that I heard, saw, listened to, have you all kind of begin a conversation from there, and then the wonderful humans who organized this whole event, we'll give them the floor to ask some more targeted questions, and then we'll open it up for general conversation, and with that way we will close out the day. So, all right. So I think one of the most beautiful things about the conversations that happened today, right, were these reflections on the self, particularly the ways in which the self is constructed in relationship to narrative, right? If there was anything that was really holistically present. And this is, of course, a relationship to the stories we tell about ourselves, the stories we tell others about ourselves, right? And the nature of our own experiences, the perception of those experiences, right? And the kind of multivalence layers that all of this can take on by virtue of what it means to be a human being. And at the same time, there was a lot of conversation about the limits of those things, right? What are the limits of what can be communicated, right? Even if it is accessible to me, it might not be communicable to myself at the same time, right? And so there are limits to what this notion of self can do for us, and it has to do with communicability, I think, and that's one thing that I saw all of you bringing to the fore in different types of ways, right? And then finally, questions about the coherency of the self, right? What does it mean for the self to have coherency, and how we navigate the expectations of coherency differently depending on where we're situated and the experiences we carry. So I have kind of three major kinds of threads or bridges that I just want to throw on the table. The first one is a question about insights. And I offer this one to all of you. Insight. So in the notions, or in our makings and unmakings of selfhood that have been kind of discussed today, I'm wondering about what it means to have insight into our own experiences. And I think we might often take for granted a sense of transparency with our notions of selfhood that might not always hold sometimes, variably hold, I don't know. But I'm really curious to hear about how you're all thinking about our relationships to the very narratives that we produce, right? And our accessibility to self. And that brings me to a kind of second point, which has to do with temporality, right? So in our insights to selves that we have, however we might be naming them, how does this relate to our notions of time? And I think that there's questions about coherency that are certainly threaded into that. And lastly, and I was really like kind of moved by the last kind of closing points in the last presentation about building bridges to the unknown, because I think there's something happening here with respect to the things we just don't know, right? That are really, really fundamental to the human experience, right? Is that we actually, there's a lot that we don't know, and that seems to be a confrontation with our own mortalities, right? It's a question about the limits of living and dying as much as it is about how much we can name about those things, right? And so how are you all thinking about that, those proximities, right? That we're always there, they're always there, even if we're not necessarily reflecting on them. So with that, I will give you all the floor.
I think there was that scissors paper.
I had students do that this week, actually, in their presentations. Do you want to rock, paper, scissors from the best first?
No, thank you, Stephanie, for those great points. And I want to say that there was a time in which I really thought that there was this transparency. You know, as a phenomenologist, I'm very interested in the first person perspective. And we're very interested in this perspective, and we build a great deal in our thought from that perspective. But I think it carries the vestiges of the Cartesian account, where you have this transparency of the mind, where you can be aware of everything that is in you. And I think that what I have learned from people who work very closely with discourse and narrativity and poetry in I don't want to say non-philosophical way, but in a more affective way, even though it has philosophical insights, is the fact that there's so much that we cannot know about our own selves. And I take it that's precisely one of the reasons why we do what you call redoubling, and why we come up with these narratives, right? In which we that organize ourselves in such a way that we think that we know what's going on with ourselves. And so maybe one of the interesting things that we can think further about is the fact that we might need to be more open, right? Maybe more humility as to how much we don't know, and the fact that we don't know ourselves as well as we would want to know, and to recognize that the narratives, that these stories that we're depending for our own vision of ourselves, to make ourselves, might be merely fictions that we always wanted, right? And so what do we do with that knowledge? Is it something, does that mean that we're just perpetually deceiving ourselves? Not necessarily, as I think you pointed out, right? That even when in the end the narrative doesn't connect to reality, it allows us to have some kind of life and to perform certain things in our life that we want to do, or as to put it, to be generative. And so I think what I learned is humility about the not knowing of myself, and what that lack of knowledge leads me to do, and leads me to a path which might connect me not only to stories that might be helpful to my life, but to stories that are also exclusive of others, right? And what you're calling redoubling, and that bring in some violence against others.
It's interesting to, I don't know, what does it mean to know yourself anyway. I mean, so in narrative identity, we think, well, you have some sense of who you are by finding a narrative, finding a story that seems to explain to you and others in a way that's culturally valued, how you came to be and where your life's going. And there's some certain kind of self-knowledge with that. But there's so much, as you point out, that can't, not only is it not verbal, you know, so it might be affective, emotional feelings, senses, smells, just this intuition about something or another. You know something, but you can't put it into words. So not only is it outside the verbal realm, but it can maybe never be verbalized. Mark Freeman, who's a psychologist and philosopher both, I really respect greatly, talks a lot about the narrative unconscious. And I think what he means is that there are these realms of experience that they're very much about who we are, but we just can't narrate. We can't put them in words. Sometimes because they're too threatening, as maybe Freud would have suggested. Sometimes because we don't have the categories in our culture for like slotting those experiences into sentences and paragraphs. And sometimes because they're just, they're not, you can't know them that way. So you have to know them some other way outside of language. And yeah, I mean, there's a whole subterranean realm of self, of what you are, that I just feel we don't have access to. And it does give you humility.
I kept thinking about I guess all the things I don't know about the self, because I was thinking that when you were doing both metaphorically and literally a dance between between worlds. You were going between worlds. Are
you talking about the top?
Yeah, which was wonderful.
It was great.
But you were in between the worlds, and it was like you were. And obviously, I love that description of being in between worlds, and that's like you fit in those worlds. But then immediately during your talk, I was thinking, where does the redemption happen? And what exactly do people think the redemption is that they show to themselves? Is it that they tried to go out to a different world and then they returned to their world? And that's what I was kind of redoubling, like you show your world to yourself. And that's your narrative so that you know where you stand. They write these books, right, to like say, this is my journey, my story, because they're trying to establish themselves, especially like as politicians, right? Like I'm going to assert my story, and it has this redemptive arc. Is it because they came back from another world that scared them? Or is it because they have the new wisdom of what it means to be between both worlds, or to be in between worlds? Or is the redemption a posturing of that I've come back to my world and I want to stand on this world and never return to the other world? Or like, is there an openness to other worlds beyond the two? You were between two, but they're really, you can be between multiple.
Right.
And so like, is that redemptiveness, do you notice it being like, I don't want to return to any other world, now I know where I am, where I stand? Because that's always like, we accuse politicians of being terrible when they flip-flop, but the truth is, I kind of want a person who's experienced different positions and they've changed their mind on things and they have a wisdom that has accrued from seeing their errors. I like that, a mature individual who can hold contradictions within themselves. But politically, of course, that's a flip-flopper. So I always get the sense that they want to frame it like, I've returned to my space, I know who I am, I'll never change. But I wanted to ask you about that after your talk. Like, how do you frame that?
Well, I don't think redemptiveness is a psychological quality. I think it's a literary thing. So it's in the story. So Barack Obama tells a redemptive story about his life. But he's not a redemptive person. Like, that adjective doesn't work. Okay? He might be a resilient person, he might be a wise person, he might be a person who sees himself on a journey. But so when I use the word redemption, maybe it's not maybe it's not a good term. It's pretty circumscribed in terms of its applicability. It applies to the story itself that is told. So where is the redemption? It's just in the story. But what you're asking, I think, is, well, but where's the psychological reality in this person's life whereby they went through this transformation and so forth. And I mean, it's different for each one of them. I mean, and it's not usually an epiphany, but sometimes it's remembered that way. So for George W. Bush, it was in that Holiday Inn restaurant where he sat down, he claims, where he sat down with this minister and had this religious conversion experience. And that's like, he believes, and I think maybe there's something to it in his case, that that's where it happened. But other people, I don't know. I mean, it's just so, it's different. And it can be any of those things you suggested. It could be going back to something I left behind. It could be fearing what I went through and leaving that and trying something else. I don't have a normative, general, common description of it.
I love your answer. Thank you for that. I think about it from a theological perspective because I'm so aware of the danger in someone giving a narrative for even a literary narrative of redemption for themselves, where they're wanting to stand on a foundation that cannot be questioned. They do not want to return to other worlds. They now know their world. It is a very monolithic understanding of the world. It's like when someone, and I've seen this in Bush's language, like that Protestant evangelical of clinging to the one moment that now is going to identify me for the rest of my life. It is my salvation. It's also unquestionable, right? Like
in this case, it is.
Yeah,
it doesn't necessarily come with the story. I mean, other people do it differently. I mean, Obama doesn't. It's not his. It's not. Biden is very ambivalent. It's got all kinds of different. I mean,
yes. Well, that's my point. Like, so it could be a negative, or you could criticize it in the sense of when someone says, and I love the redoubling of this. I believe because I believe because I believe, which I've heard so many times from evangelicals.
It's Bush would say, I believe what I believe and what I believe. I say, I know what is true, and I believe that I believe what is true, or something like that. But I thought about it when you said it. I thought, boy, that was George W.
Right. And I would say we have to be able to critique some of these narratives because they have not just a religious connotation, but then they take on a political one. It's an attempt to assert a certain form of sovereignty, I would say, in some way. And it could be really called into question. But I love what you're saying, that there are other ways to approach the narrative where there's nuance or where there's a possibility of saying, okay, I stand here now, but I realize I could stand somewhere else later. But at the moment, this is where I am. Maybe there's a security in that, but also a recognition of the vulnerability of it or something. I just didn't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't rule that out. It's just, I mean, one way or the other.
If I may add, I think that Ansaldúa is instructive here because basically it's not just, it's also about the danger of univocity, right? And Maria Lugones is important here. The idea is precisely not, is to move away from this understanding of oneself, which I understood to be, I thought that in at least the particular account of narrative identity you were giving is that the story itself is the identity. And so redemption, if the story is redemptive, that the person would be redemptive as well. But that's how I understood it.
Yeah, that's not how I think of it. Generativity is a psychological quality. People are high in generativity, tell redemptive stories, but they're not redemptive people. The stories are redemptive, the people are generative.
Right, but they see themselves as redemptive.
They see their stories as redemptive. They seeing yourself, they have all kinds of other ways they see themselves too. I mean, you can attribute traits to yourself. George W. Bush is an extrovert. That's not part of the story, but it's part of his self.
Right, but my point was just to say that if you did give an account, and I think it's a recurrent account, right, that it's not the case that you have the distinction between the narratives are told and lives are lived, that you have those two intertwined. And so the story is the identity insofar as you are making yourself by way of the story. But what I wanted to add in terms of Ansaldúa was that the issue, I love your question because you're asking where is it coming from, and basically what is initiating this moment of redemption, because the answer, depending on the answer, you might want the redemptive story or not at all, right? If you want the redemptive story, just because you went to another world and you found that world to be too scary, you come back and you want the world where you feel that you have the power, the sovereignty, and you stay there, and then you rethink it, come back to yourself and feel even better because you experienced something that was not so good, and then you come back and, okay, I'm staying here. Then definitely that's not the kind of redemptive story that maybe somebody like Azaldúa would be interested in. In the first place, I think that what she would say is that there is no moment when there is just this redemption that stays. And this comes back to your question, the second part of your question, which has to do with temporality. And so and when thinking about the story, it's not an Aristotelian account, of a linear account of a sequence of nows, which leaves you start here. You know, when I was doing my dance, right, I can go here. I went from the middle to here. I decide I go here to a world and it sucks. And so I go back and then I try this other world and I feel good and sovereign and powerful. So I'm going to stay there and then feel like, oh, I went there and now, wow, I've done it. This is great. What Azaldúa suggests is that a lot of us, for a lot of multiplicity of selves that are marginalized, we're constantly in the in-between. That is to say, we're always telling multiple stories, which at the same time might be contradictory, because we are feeling contradictories as we go from world to world. And so our stories end up being very complex. And so there is no linear moment where you move from one place to the other and I've made it, but you're going back and forth and you think in terms of a phenomenological account of temporality in which you are in the present, but also anticipating your future by being, and also informed by the past. And so in this account, you can't just simply sit with the redemption, even if you were to get some kind of redemption. So the temporality becomes complex, and the stories we tell of ourselves that are the reason why we are who we are become very complex and open. Open also to what's unconscious. You mentioned Mariah Schechman. I love her work because what she's adding to Locke is precisely the fact that even the unconscious elements of ourselves are part of the story that we're telling, even though we might not have been we might not have known what was going on in terms of those elements.
I like that a lot, and this is part of why I was asking the question, because my question is something like, if a person is living that life, feeling caught between multiple worlds, and so their story is open, it's also more complex, and perhaps it recognizes more the interdependency,
yes,
and it also recognizes the plurality in a way, but it also, I would say, from a political theological perspective, it weakens that person in a sense. You're not as autonomous. You're not as likely to be the head of a hegemonic order. So I'm not in favor of that, but I'm thinking that would be a typical way I would understand and see that position being sort of weakened publicly, socially, culturally. So my question would be, could a person who's caught between worlds like that, who may not be able to fit the redemptive story in the same way as like these political leaders you were talking about, do you think someone in between worlds is less likely to be a generative personality?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think somebody between worlds might. I don't think it goes one way or the other. Somebody between worlds may be more generative or less generative, but clearly the experience of being betwixt and between, that kind of liminal phenomenology, is going to impact their generativity. Let me just say something about the redemptive self. This is just one story. Those folks who are telling this, I mean, they tell all kinds of stories. I mean, there might be 7 or 8 different stories being told in that interview. We are just pulling out a set of themes that we see consistently associated with generativity. But it's not the only thing that's going on. And so there's nothing keeping, in fact, in many of these participants' cases, these highly generative adults have other stories going too. And they may feel sometimes betwixt and between. But we nonetheless find a little bit of this redemption stuff, more so in their stories than we do with people lower in generativity. So it doesn't preclude these other ways of approaching the world in terms of openness, in terms of being in a liminal state, in terms of, there just is all kinds of different possibilities. And so we're just, this is the problem when you do research like this, you gotta count, you gotta run a test. We can't just say stuff. We actually have to find, so we find correlations, but it's just a part of it all. And to really get at, to do the kind of deep experience near thick description that they all do so well, you have to go deep with one person. And there are some of us who do that, but the research I described today, it sacrifices that.
Right.
In an effort to see if we can find some general connections. But it's very, very limited.
I also add, I think it's not just the prompts that may be redemptive or not and have these different themes present, but you could conceptualize the person as having like a certain narrative form per world, if you will. So for somebody who's stuck between worlds, if one of those worlds is sort of the reality of dealing with the cancer diagnosis, say, and the treatment goes well and they feel like they've healed from that and they moved on, they might tell a redemptive arc about that particular aspect of that identity, but that doesn't mean that that's extracted from, their gender or political affiliation or whatever else might be going on. In the case of these, larger autobiographies, it does seem more to collapse because it's one book about an entire life. But you can take these themes and consider it at the level of maybe like individual aspects of identity as well. Like what was the story of this particular experience that you had, right?
I just got to add one thing and I'll defer. I loved how you opened up and said theologians sort of set it up and then they kind of fade away. So I'm going to do that right now. So people, they have domain-specific stories, okay? So I have a story about myself as a professor. I have a story about myself as a husband. I have a story about myself maybe as a kid. And they're not all part of the same novel. I used to think they were back when I, in that decade, when we came up with these ideas originally. But it becomes clearer and clearer when you do this research. It's kind of obvious, but sometimes it takes psychologists a long time to see the obvious. And that is that to the extent narrative identity exists in people's lives, it's not a big, fat novel that's perfectly coherent. It's more like an anthology of related stories that have some overlapping themes. And those stories pick up on different features of the self. And so the multiplicity that you talk about, the multiple self, that's the norm, I think. And you have a lot of different stories going on, but they still kind of overlap a little bit, and you start to see some similar themes. And so for me, a model, I don't know how many of you know the Olive Kitteridge. It's a collection of stories by Elizabeth Strauss, so beautiful. I assigned it in one of my classes on Egypt. And the stories kind of relate to each other. They're all set in this town. Olive Kitteridge is the protagonist, but she's not even in every one of them. Sometimes she's there, sometimes she isn't. I think people's narrative identities are kind of like Olive Kitteridge. They're like this anthology of overlapping narratives. And for some people, they kind of cohere a little more tightly. George Bush probably, he's pretty tight in the way he sees himself. Other people a little looser, kind of have more things, more diversity in their narratives. It might be more open, I think. So the anthology is more spread out and there's less overlap among the stories. And every once in a while, there'll be some folks that the stories have nothing to do with each other. And then that's when you start talking about like interesting splits in identity that might border on being problematic. That almost like dissociation. But that's weird and that's unusual. Strange.
Although I do have to say that Olive Kitteridge, whom I love, she's very grumpy.
Yeah.
But she also has an amazing heart. And so in each
Oh,
story,
that second story, but oh, that's
yeah,
where she sits down with that kid.
yes, each story tells you about her character, and there's a certain consistency in the character. And so, again, bringing up Ansaldúa, I think what's interesting, and a lot of Latina feminist thought, what's interesting is this idea where you have, and I think connected to what you said at the end, there will be moments where the contradictions, there will be contradictions of different, and you're thinking in terms of anthologies, so different chapters will be where Olive is totally different, right? And it makes no sense that Olive is describing the story this way. In other words, you have a contradiction in this deep sense that maybe Olive is somebody else. And the question is whether that's due to trauma and whether that's pathological. And I guess one of the things that I've learned about from Ansaldúa and Maria Lugones when they talk about these things is that given marginalization, it is harder to create these stories that have this arcs where there seems to be this kind of continuity. There will be cases where it is not pathological, and yet I really feel like I'm completely different in different worlds. And I think it will be a very interesting kind of novel, right, to have that kind of a narrative. And so it's not so much that there's a thread uniting the stories in terms of the character of Olive, but that Olive herself is undergoing some transformation, even beyond her 50s, right? When she's thinking, she's very, very different. And why is she different? And can she tell that story without this sense that there's something pathological going on? And I think that's what's interesting to me about our conversation, our interdisciplinary conversation, to see whether these moments, these ruptures, as Ansaldúa talks about, and arrebatamientos, are such that they can lead to a loss of self, right? To be somebody different, or to have a multiple dissociative disorder.
Well, I think even in Olive Kitteridge, there's, I don't know how many read this, there is one story that's so hard to reconcile with the other, and it's a trauma. She goes to the hospital and there's a terrorist attack, and the way she reacts to it, and you never come back to it. Like, you know, they hardly ever go back. So I sort of feel like that is an example of a dissociation. She has almost like a dissociative experience. And so that story doesn't fit in the anthology, but it's in there anyway, because that's where Olive Kitteridge is, right? I never made the connection before.
Are you ready?
Sure.
All right.
Well, thank you all. This is really an interesting discussion. So one thing I kind of, I'm thinking about this normative notion of the good life that you brought up, Dr. McAdams, your lecture. And, you know, my question was to say how much does this, you know, normative notion of the good life depends on, you know, a particular culture's set of values, right? And how the narratives, you know, capture this way of thinking about, or this what the culture values. And now in this discussion, and after hearing your talk, I'm also thinking about how this normative notion of the good life may function as sovereign notion of the good life within a world. Right, so I'm thinking, for example, in the case of Ansaldúa, right, like what does it mean to speak good Spanish, you know, in one world, or you know, the sort of demands, the normative demands that one world makes in terms of what it means to live a good life, right? And so when Ansaldúa finds herself in the Anglo world, right, the Anglo world poses a different conception of what is the good life, right? And so this normative notion of the good life almost functions as a sovereign within particular worlds that, you know, marginalized peoples find themselves sort of torn between normative conceptions of the good life. right? And so in this sense, I think, this multiplicitous way of thinking about the self, it is almost sort of escaping, right, this sovereign conceptions of the self, in a way that, for example, I couldn't find out in your talk. It almost, you gave me the sense that, sort of every time we sort of renounce sovereignty, we become sovereign ourselves, right? Whereas I wonder if in the multiplicitous, conception of the self that you're providing, we are kind of escaping, right, with this sort of negative dialectics. We are sort of, almost renouncing sovereignty, right? In the sense that, we find ourselves in between sort of sovereign notions of the good life.
I think you're right. I think there is a temptation and a possibility, a risk that in renouncing a sovereign order, you're trying to strike a position that is sovereign itself. It's just displacing it from I was thinking the Catholic-Protestant split. Protestantism introduces a modern shift where, like as Foucault talks about, the sovereignty goes into our bodies. It's into each individual. It's no longer like a hierarchical imposition.
Right.
It goes into a more democratic form. It's now all of us really stand as these little autonomous units. So I definitely think that's part of the reading. I think the way I talked about Agamben's notion of whatever being is that sovereignty is sort of restored to each individual in that way. I don't know if we can totally fight that shift, but I acknowledge what you're saying, that the model you're presenting may provide some alternative forms to that, to say, well, maybe the sovereignty is always, even if it's at an individual level, it's displaced between various relations between people. Maybe to some degree. I mean, I was thinking of it as an ongoing dialectic that all of us face in ourselves. It's that battle with ourselves and our desire to be in charge of ourselves and controlling ourselves. I do think there's the effective side of it. Yeah, I don't have a great answer, but that's why you didn't sense the answer in what I was saying, because I'm never sure. Like it just feels like an ongoing battle that's always there. I don't have any way to.
Can I throw out a question to him on sovereignty? No, because it's such a great term, and I've never heard a psychologist use it. I mean, they would know what you meant. They would understand it. But they would ask you this, so I'll speak for them. What's the difference between sovereignty on the one hand and what psychologists call agency or even healthy self-efficacy on the other? A lot of the problems that psychologists confront, especially clinicians in therapy and so forth, is not with patients who have too much sovereignty, or at least too much agency, but rather who feel helpless, who feel that they're buffeted about by forces that they can't control, who feel stuck in loops, who have anxiety that's debilitating, who are depressed and can't get out of bed in the morning. And so part of what they're trying to help these individuals accomplish is some modicum of agency, some sense that when you get up in the morning, you own your experience, at least to a certain extent. Even though we know that you're buffeted about by a lot of forces beyond your control, these folks take that way too far, the psychologists would say. And so there's so much of an effort to instill agency in people, to give them a healthy sense of self-efficacy, and also in the process to have them be nicer to themselves. This whole idea of self-compassion is part of that. Don't be so hard on yourself. That kind of goes with it too. So sovereignty isn't that, right? Or is it?
Well, no, your question is fantastic, because I find it's very difficult to so your question is wonderful to me because it's invoking a whole language and a discourse about how we do need to be, let's say, in control of ourselves to some degree. We need to feel that autonomy. We need to be able to say, I need to possess a sense of agency to make decisions to go out into the world. When that discourse flies into, this is what I see in Foucault's work, when it flies into a long history of political theological notions of sovereignty, the way in which God's sovereignty is defined as an autonomous existence from humanity, but somehow it directs Christ's divinity and it gives rulers the right to rule. It slips into a discourse of not just the sense of agency, but of power, privilege, of domination, of the, et cetera. Are those things that are sometimes resonant with the psychology of the individual? Yes. But like I'm thinking of, and I'm speaking here even autobiographically to a degree, like the heteronormative white man, right? Like, I know what that means to absorb a discourse psychologically of agency that's more than just agency. It's a strong sense of agency that you're entitled to and that you don't have to risk. You don't have to risk it socially, and you're not having it taken away from you socially, and you are able to go forward and to be something and to be recognized as something and to take it for granted. I don't have to go see a psychiatrist because I struggle with a sense of agency. It would be like a cheap way to put it, but something like that. And then when that discourse flies in the face of people who would use theoretical conversations about sovereignty to then talk about, well, how have I, as someone who has not received the entitlements to the American white heterosexual man, like that discourse of agency could really be enabling people to go forward and do something. And so I struggle with a sense of agency because I feel disempowered and made to be vulnerable socially, culturally, politically. And there's a struggle there, and that's psychological too, because then there's a struggle to find a sense of agency and be recognized for what it is that you present publicly, socially. So it's hard for me to answer because then I think you're exactly right. Like I always think of, well, I mean, if someone lets go of their sense of the sovereign self, as some theologians have called it, you could risk running. I refer to it as like an instability, like a personal narrative, just an instability. Because I'm not a psychologist, I don't know what you've been destabilized in your narrative, and you may need to go receive help to find agency, the exact way you describe it. And there's always the risk. So I mean, that's why I want to be like a sliding scale. Like you talked about Bush, like his narrative is tighter in a sense, and I want to say maybe that's because he's drifting closer to what I'm describing as a political theological imposition of some form or some type of sovereignty. Whereas someone else, it's not so tight, they recognize the loose ends, and so there is a sense of agency, but it's different. And it's a matter of degrees. I don't want to be so absolute in my own view on it, but I think the history of it coming from theology, because of God being an omnipotent being, except it becomes a very fixed idea for a lot of people historically. I don't know if that makes sense or
No, it makes a lot of sense. And as you were talking, I'm reminded of the writings of, he's a psychologist, we also kind of dabbled in theology and philosophy, David Bakken, who's long gone, but he wrote in the 50s and 60s, and he sort of coined this term agency. We talk about unmitigated agency. And unmitigated agency, I think, is your sovereignty maybe on steroids. And that is that, like, okay, so this is an individual who has enough agency, but it's not softened by anything else. It's not softened by compassion. It's not softened by what he called communion, because agency and communion are these two great motivational forces. And communion needs to mitigate agency. It needs to soften it. You need to care for others. You need to see other points of view. And I think all those kinds of things are what would not be possible with the sovereign self, because a sovereign is not just agentic, but all powerful and immune to other considerations. And so if you can mitigate your agency, if you can soften it, if you can temper it and mix it with these other, kinder features of human nature, better angels of our nature, if you can do it, then he liked that. He thought that would be, that's kind of the best way to go.
Yeah, I thought.
May I come in before it becomes just a dialogue between both of you?
Yes, I'm just going to. Go ahead.
I just want to redirect the conversation because it seems to me that I find it really interesting that all of a sudden the conversation becomes about agency, and we're not thinking beyond the notion of agency itself. That is to say, in psychology, the idea is like the person who has issues that maybe is marginalized, that they need a more sense of agency, and we're talking about a sliding scale, right? where there you have the bad agency, it's the sovereign agency, and then the kinder agency. Can we not think beyond agency, right? The idea that perhaps I take it that one of the things that Latina feminists are doing is precisely using discourse in order to rethink what has been some of the strongest fictions that have been created for the purposes of colonization and control. And one of them is precisely the idea of agency. And hence, when you have Ansaldúa writing these stories, part of what she's doing is saying, I read a quotation in my paper when she's talking about the suspension, right, of forms, normative forms that we know. What's one of the biggest fictions is this idea of agency itself, in which theology becomes the all sovereign God, right, himself. And so you're thinking about moving the scale, but why not rethink the notion of agency itself in a way that does not allow us to even think of the scale of this scale, but a redescription of what it would mean to have sociality among human beings. And that's what I see somebody like Maria Lugones, for example, doing, precisely introducing this account where we're not forging relations, a nice agent forging relations to another nice agent, etc., but trying to rethink what sociality would mean if I see myself already as a relational being. So I would suggest that another opportunity here, another possibility is to the redirection, the rethinking of having to start with the notion of agency in the first place, as important as this notion has been. Anyway, that would be my suggestion.
Shall we take another question from the group?
Actually, can we continue on this thread?
Yeah, I mean, just feel free to jump in.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to be formal.
I actually am really glad we got to this place because I was going to pose eventually the issue that we're all talking about individual narratives at this point, or it seems that we are, with the underlying assumption that this is not still very much in community. The second that my voice leaves my mouth, it is of your ears. I cannot change how you would narrate me and your story. And so we're deeply, again, already interrelational being. And how does it then change what we're doing? We're talking about sovereignty, or we're talking about people like George W. Bush and who they're writing for, because it doesn't matter if they're writing a story. It's still a story of other people and themselves. It's never going to be that we pull out a human being and they have a narrative if they're outside not only each other, but the world. And so I wonder then, when we're talking about these like kind of individual narratives, if we can actually do that. Can you have this individual narrative in a neat, clean, clinical way away from people, which I don't think you're suggesting, but if we fully embrace the ways, again, we are interrelational, the ways in which we are dependent upon one another for narrative, for the language of that narrative, for the content of that narrative, for the time of that narrative, what does that then look like? Because I know, talking to Dr. Ortega like earlier, because I quite like that Lugones kind of breaks down the I into the we, which can be problematic, but it seems relevant for the nature of what we are of the world, so not just in it, because there is this of the world we are physically stuck together. Mr. Elon Musk, you are physically stuck on this planet in time with one another, and then where do we go from there? Yeah. I mean, if you have a rocket ship, you're free to go, if you would like. But I think that then changes how we have to approach narrative identity. Because if I don't know what to call myself, that's not just because, you know, I'm ignorant or like have lack of access, but it's also that I can't know what to call myself in every space with every person because I'm not capable of anticipating what every person thinks of me. But still, it informs who I am, if that makes any sense. So, or like who I am to them. If I may, I think that the difficulty, at least from
the perspective of all of our disciplines maybe is that we have always started from the I. I mean, it's something that we inherited, right? I mean, it's just this notion of the solus ipse at first that we were trying to correct all the time. And so we don't move away from that paradigm. Even when we're trying to be communal, we start from the I, rather than starting from the whole, right? It's rather the same idea. We try to go from the parts to the whole when we could also start realizing that we have a whole, right, in the first place.
I think I love that, and I think about it as maybe a limitation of our social and political imagination, because like one of the things I want to explore more, and I haven't written on really yet, but like I always wonder, is there a resonance between, Ken Torowitz talks about the king's two bodies in medieval political theology, that the king has his real, the actual physical body of the person who is the king, but then there's also a body that survives the finite body of the king. There's two bodies to the king, and this is a big piece of how sovereignty is depicted in the medieval scheme. And the one body is eternal, and the other body is finite, dies with the actual death of the body. But really, the king's body, which is sort of divine in a way, it lives on. And I always think about that with Descartes. Like, is there some notion in which the king's two bodies, and that's an expression of sovereignty, transfers into a modern philosophical context as the mind dominates over the body? Now, the mind is sort of sovereign over the body, which is very finite. It's as if sovereignty has just moved into our bodies, right? As again, like Foucault would say, but now it's like this medieval political theology becomes a modern, the mind dominates the body. And that is a whole political model, as well as a philosophical model, as well as it focuses on the I in relation to our body being. That's also part of our social imagination, right? Like that's all we can see. So then I think we're still dealing with dictatorships and tyrannies and the idea of dominating one thing over another. I think we got to get to a different political and social imagination of the we and the community and different political forms. And maybe we could start talking about a different way to begin the conversation. And we are doing that in some ways. But I think socially, large scale, we're still, some people are stuck a ways back and some are trying to see new models.
Other questions? Yeah.
I was listening to you and I found it interesting that at the beginning we were talking about narratives, and then there were stories that appearing. And I was wondering if this may be a methodological question. If the narrative and its methodology and its discipline kind of assumes some certain qualities of coherency and accessibility and transparency and even the dichotomy of fiction and non-fiction. And if you find that story is maybe a more liberating word, or you were just using them in, like as synonyms in the way you were talking, because it was very clear for me that sometimes you were using narrative and then you were talking about stories. And the stories seems to be a little, at least how I hear you, seems to have a little bit more liberatory of this trust that you are seeing the three of you did that.
I plead guilty to the interchangeability thing, but yeah, I many psychologists do that. They'll sort of use them interchangeably. I mean, we sort of see some distinctions. I mean, for me, story seems a little more specific in that way. I mean, so a story, a narrative is something that you narrate, you tell. Usually it's a story, but I suppose you can tell other things. I mean, so yeah, I kind of like the word story in some ways better because it suggests a beginning, middle, and an end. It suggests a character who's motivated and moves forward in time. It suggests a plot. And I don't know, those kinds of, I like those metaphors. Narrative doesn't summon that up for me as much when we think of the word narrative. But then again, they call it narrative identity. They don't call it story identity. dumb answer. You guys.
No, I didn't think about the difference. I was using them fairly interchangeably in a way.
Oh,
Yeah.
I feel better now.
I think of them differently, and I think of narrative in terms more of emplotment, the sort of when the story has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Right.
And I think of stories more in when I read Ansaldúa, for example, I think more in terms of stories that might not necessarily have that beginning. I'm open to thinking, well, Clarice Lispector, for example, the work of Lispector, of some of her books, or any kind of book where you can just pick up, right, and start it and then close it, and that's it. And there are books that have been written that way, that do not have the traditional narrative. And so I think of narrative more in terms of having the recurrent, emplotment. And I think of stories, they seem to be, they may have it, but not necessarily. So I do see them as having more of a everyday connection, even your own when you're writing, when you write notes to yourself or in your diary, or you write a story, but you're not really thinking of making it coherent the way that somebody who's an author or writer, writing short stories is one of the most difficult things, right? Because you have to say so much in one, and there has to be some kind of coherence, etc. And so I do think of the word itself, to me, seems more liberatory.
I think we have disciplinary differences.
Yes.
Psychologists, they talk about story grammars, and a story grammar has that plot that you're talking about.
Yeah.
They don't talk about narrative grammar. So
Wow.
it's just really interesting. Everything you said about narrative.
It's the other way around. I wonder how much of it has to do with, it's communicable, right? It's what can communicate and how it's being communicated. And I feel like a lot of what's been happening here is linguistically, presumes a linguistic something, right? Some symbolic linguistic order. But then I'm also thinking about those landscapes. And those landscapes talk. They talk and they're loud, right? Because you closed out with this very profound, I could see it and I could hear it, right? And those landscapes speak, right? But do they tell a story? Do they narrate? What would be the term, right? And what I feel like I'm grasping is as something that's just not linguistic, right? Symbolically represented as such. It's communicating for sure, right? Because I'm sensing it and you're sensing it and you're writing about it, right? But it's not in words, right? It might be in Ansaldúa's, visions, dreams, right? How she talks about that stuff. But it's what can be communicated, right? Either linguistically or not, something like that. So
it's almost ineffable.
It's ineffable.
Right? It's sublime, right?
Yeah.
We were talking about when you see, I was also struck when you brought that example, because I was thinking some words could never really explain what it means to be in front of or looking at the Grand Canyon. I remember I've seen all the photos before, but then I get there, right? My jaw drops.
Right.
And so there's a certain ineffability, and yet a story might be able to bring it to the fore, but not necessarily via the one-to-one connection of words and references to the words, right? But as a whole, something might happen. But that doesn't mean that there is a coherence, but it just means that you're able to grasp something that it's not easily explained just through other combinations of words.
Yes. I was wondering how much the body really plays a role in this kind of thing that you're talking about. And you talked about carnal aesthetics,
Yes.
like a whole. And
a lot of my questions about the presentations are how much narrative or story, or how much it seems to be described as this cerebral event, this mental exercise, and where's the body in that? When you talk about the mouth and the kind of, the visceral idea of pulling your intestines through your mouth, there's very bodily images. I mean, I work with women in birth stories, so it's very embodied. And I'm just interested what I mean, you touched on this bit just now when we talk about the eye. Why do we start with the eye? Is it about the way we tell stories now too? We no longer sing them and mime them and dance them out. Where's the body gone in our stories?
Blame language. I mean, Daniel Dorr writes that language, we don't really know when it emerged, but it emerged to tell better stories. But I think maybe a lot's lost too. I mean, before language, there was mimesis, and you could tell a story through gesture. You still can. Pantomime and ballet, there's all kinds of ways, bodily ways to tell stories, I think, and express them. Language gives you certain kind of precision, but in some ways it takes you further from the experience, from the guts of it. So we talk about how, I mean, that's really, I was just thinking in psychology. So, when people started writing about narratives, it was in what's called the cognitive revolution period in psychology, which was like maybe 1960 to 1990. But now psychology is much more about the body, as it turns out. And the whole idea of embodied cognition is a thing that we didn't talk about that at all back when the idea of narrative identity was sort of coming to be. So I think that the people who study narrative identity are trying to catch up and understand how, first of all, how the body is part of the story, but also how certain forms of expression are not verbal narrative at all, but yet they are, they're part of who we are. And, we talked about earlier how they're sort of, in some cases, not tellable. I mean, a picture may be worth 1,000 words, but it doesn't equal the 1,000 words. The 1,000 words don't quite get it either, because it's just something there I can't put in words. Same thing with bodily experiences, like smells and sounds. How do you describe it?
Yeah, I talk about the fetish of theology as a quest for disembodiment, basically. So part of the history I'm dealing with in my area is that theology's been terrible about recognizing the body, and so it just relegates it to the closet. And I mean that in all senses, like we just push it away. That's not the attention, and that's, I think, with the rise of contextual theologies, so feminist theologies, post-colonial theologies, liberation theologies, queer theologies, we're getting more attentive to conversation about the body, but that's not everybody. Not most. It used to be most, but now it's still a fair amount of theologians are not comfortable with the body still, and so there's more of a fetishization of the body that takes place. Mary's body, the purity, the immaculate nature of her body, it's completely disconnected from reality. And most people don't realize that Mary's virginity, this is an example, but it's a good one, if you don't remember it. Mary's virginity is explicitly, for most of the centuries of Christianity, it's explicitly tied to her still having her hymen intact. So that the theories of her giving birth to a baby and still being a virgin after it were connected to her still miraculously having an intact hymen, even though a baby came out of her vagina. And we don't even know that. We don't even talk about that. It's like, that's a big piece of understanding Mary perpetual ever virgin.
Well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think that really flattens Mariology out and virginity too, to be frank, into simply some sort of physical state of affairs.
Maybe, but St. Ignatius was going to kill a man because he threatened Mary's virginity while walking a road in Spain. And he said, the Muslim man said, yeah, but the Muslim man actually said, I believe she was a virgin before the birth, but not after. And he was going to kill her. I mean, it's a big part of the nature of it.
I hear what you're saying, but I think there are other Christian traditions which read the materiality of the incarnation precisely into Mary's body, that it is a body that takes in the eternity of the world. that actually there's room there and a whole different kind of Mariology for re-embodying a lot of theology, that there's a massive potential precisely in that. Yes, I agree, there have been many abstracting, sort of puritanical ways out of that, but I wouldn't want to trade baby.
No, and clearly, I'm not, and maybe there are very creative ways to read it now. I'm speaking mostly to the history that's inherited, which I would say is part of the centuries of what I would call sort of a fetishization of her body. I'm not going to speak against new ways to read it, more contemporary.
Or even much older ways to read it.
Alternative traditions. Yeah.
In philosophy too, we're not supposed to have a body. We found that in the 60s. We find it in the 60s.
There it is.
And we read about it. And we wrote books. But part of my work actually is trying to show how Anzaldua's writing and her use of discourse and her practices. In a sense, I'm reading Anzaldúa in a very Merleau-Pontian way, because in Merleau-Ponty you see with your entire body, right? And so the idea is that when you are writing, you are very attuned to what your body is telling you in terms of all its senses, including the unconscious, including the spiritual aspects, etc. And so what I want to bring to light is that the very activity of writing is connected to all the other senses. That it's a complete aesthesis. It's an aesthetic moment, this writing, and that it's beyond the cognitive. And sometimes we do think of writing, right, as very cognitive, putting words together and making sure that they have the right meaning and that they go together well. That's not how she thinks of writing. And so in my work, I'm trying to show this as a aesthetic aspect of writing.
Yeah. I can jump in. I'm curious from all your particular disciplinary perspectives, what you think as theology students, what do you think about God? And I know that there are many gods and many lords and many ways to interpret God. Do you think it has or can have a positive role to play in narrative identity? Would you want to say it's always an impositional, absolute? God is always absolute impositional, sort of sovereign. That's projection of the human person. God is an optional extra, and you all have your own disciplinary perspective. So, whatever you want to say, but I want to leave it open-ended. But as as a theology student, this is what intrigues me. What do you think?
God can be a main character in a life narrative. Can be a protagonist, can be an antagonist. We have, I mentioned some religious references and the examples I gave and so forth. It's no surprise to people in the room that many midlife American adults, when they talk about their lives, their religious perspectives play out, and they are important. I don't know where to go beyond that. This is really boring, so I'll just give it a couple sentences. There's a whole empirical literature looking at things like belief in God and its relationship to psychological well-being and so on. It tends to be a positive association. Religious observance tends to be associated with better health, better happiness, higher levels of generativity. So although psychologists can be quite secular and really suspicious of theological notions, the research that they do tends to put religion in some ways in a very positive light. That's also implicated in other studies in social psychology, looking at things like discrimination and prejudice, certain forms of religion. But that's really religion, not God. So went down that path there.
Can I add something? I'm a clinical psychologist.
Yeah, go for it.
So I'd love to add an anecdote with my own clients that I have. God is never the problem, it's the religiosity that's the problem, always. It's always the structures in which God is supposed to be prayed to or honored in whatever way. So never once, ever, in all of my clients has God ever been the problem, and it's often the conflict in which folks have with, I believe in God, I love God, I love my relationship with God, and yet I'm being told that I'm a sinner and I'm going to go die in hell because of my actions or because of who I am as a person. But that's not because of God, that's because of what the religious doctrine is, or whatever it is. And that trying to split those two of like my love for God and my conflict with the religion, which I'm housing God within, is part of the problem as well. But God itself, I never use a gender when I describe God itself, is not the problem.
Interesting.
On the question of God.
You can't pass on this.
Definitely can't, sorry.
I think it's a book by Gordon Kaufman, God the Problem.
Is that a period or a question mark?
Comma. Ellipsis.
No punctuation.
Exclamation point.
I thought you were gonna bring Pessoa, that the ornament.
I definitely take an apathetic view of any way to try to describe God is probably going to fail miserably. And I'm really concerned, because political theology is one of my main interests. I'm really concerned about uses of God, the idea of God, in order to implement political agendas or specific cultural, social, natural orders, normative identities that are guaranteed by God being supposed in a certain way. When it feels like everything's been taken away from you, we've still got God to somehow maintain whatever sense of normativity we want. And I'm spending most of my time and most of my research and writing trying to dispel, that's not God, that's not God, that's not God. It feels like an apathetic exercise for me constantly. But it gets to a place where, I remember I was reading, Zizek's got that giant book, Less Than Nothing, which is a great book. And he gets toward the very end and he starts discussing Agamben's idea of profanation. Like, Agamben wants the absolute profanation of the world. Like, let's get rid of this idea of sacrality. And Zizek raises the point of, when you finally got rid of all grounds of what you thought the sacred were, and you absolutely profaned everything. Right. Is that not also the 0 degree of what the sacred could be? And I feel like I'm intrigued by that idea. I'm intrigued by this idea of what does it mean to let go of, especially in this secular age that we live in, what does it mean to not be afraid and not worry and to let go of anything we thought God was constantly, continuously? And to recognize that if we're going to have some experience of that name, beyond just the formalization of the concept of God, because I'm very cautious about the conceptual imposition of God. So again, it's apathetic. But what does it mean to have an experience of that? The only thing I could begin to touch would be something like the absolute removal of what we had thought it was. But to truly do that, to truly let that be, I don't know, that's also interesting. I gave a talk about this once to North Park, usually it's like fairly conservative, like theologians were in the audience. And they were like, so it was all, and I'm not surprised, it was like all white men, and they were really like not happy with what I was saying. And then at the end of it, a woman who works there doing counseling and therapy came up and said, I loved your talk, because this is like everybody I talked to who's falling apart, and they've lost the sense of self, and they've lost their sense of faith, but there's still something there that's really powerful. Maybe that's where authentic connection happens. Maybe that's where we're really with the other person. And I was like, thanks. And like, I think maybe that is where we begin to experience something. And maybe I'm just feeling cynical. I'm living in an age where we really have great trouble trying to hold on tightly to any idea of what God is. And I'm always nervous about it. I'm always skeptical about it.
Right. Well, yeah.
But the idea of the unknown, the mysterious, the encountering it through a negative presentation, I'm open to that. But it reminds me of like, I used to see this, or I still see this nun who's in her 70s for spiritual direction. And I would say to her, like, I don't even think I believe in God. And she's like, do you submit to something bigger than yourself? Then you're fine. You know what I mean? And I think for her, who's a deeply spiritual person, there's something to that. There's something taking place that is really powerful about that process of admitting you don't have answers and saying, I'm willing to let it go. And if that's not what it means to encounter God, then I don't necessarily want to be involved in what that encounter with God looks like. If that makes sense.
Isn't that view similar to like William James's, thinking about, like the importance of God for a psychologist? William James has this notion of God, right? It's something that like transcends the self and, so sort of pulling the self forward or something.
Right. For sure. Right. And also this idea of, even when you're all alone in the world, there's still this ideal spectacle. There's something else that transcends, and so you're never really alone. And so I think he argues that it's part of our sociality as human beings to believe in God or something like a transcendent because it establishes a relationship. But I think the way you talk about it, when we reach this sense of our limits and we feel that there's something bigger, and it gives us this sense of, humility, but also awe a little bit. That feels like God to me too. That really resonates.
How that God is what you need God to be.
God is what you need God to be. That's a beautiful way to describe it, maybe. Yeah. Thank you for that.
I was thinking I have some of the same concerns. I'm very, I always think about evil, and I am fascinated by the philosophical, theological problem of evil, which always puts you in that place where you need to ask, how could it be? How could it be possible that this supreme being, all good being, would allow for the things that we all see? And I'm fascinated by that question, and I have been for a long time. For me, it's interesting because I was in a horrible political situation where I had to flee, and I think war is, or in many cases, other traumas, right, make you think very seriously, make you confront this idea that you had been holding so tenderly, right? Because it was something that was taking care of you, and that meant infinite goodness, even if you were being bad, right? That there would be some kind of absolute, in the Catholic tradition, you repent and then things are okay. But even when you're young, you think that there's this intimacy with this notion. You're a child, you're young, but then there's this tenderness and intimacy with something bigger than you, bigger than your parents, that's supposed to be protecting all of you. And when that disappears, I think that's a moment which to me is a moment that I will never forget. And it's the moment when doubt comes in of there ever being a kind of being that is good in the way that it's and as powerful, right? Of course, process theodicy gives up, like the all-powerful, which I don't understand what God means, because usually it is the ultimate God, right, sovereign. But, and so for me, I think in terms of ineffability. And that's why, to me, I find it in art, to tell you the truth, and it's not a surprise that I'm engaging in thinking about aesthetics, because I do think that creativity and the process of creating and looking at work, at structures, or natural structures, right, that give you that sense of being in company. And so I don't think of God, and I try not to define it. I think more in terms of spirituality, connection with the relationality. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about the relationality of many things that we don't think of together. But I find that the uses of God, especially in the contemporary setting, and how God is being used to uphold to these terrible views and violent visions, right, of who we are, is just inexcusable, and yet it's happening more and more. And so I think it's interesting that I understand, I love this idea of the way that you set up the issue of sovereignty and connected to God, because it is so connected to the utter goodness, the most goodness, and yet to evil also. And so.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, because you brought us to evil, which I think is super important, because this is, I think what is from trauma to healing. And so when we're confronting these evils, I then wonder in each discipline what that actually looks like, not like evil per se, but that process of healing in the face of evil, whatever that might mean. Because we were talking about Roundtable in our reading group, just because there's also this temporal piece to it, there's embodied piece to it, this holistic piece. It's not just that you are healing the soul, but you're healing the soul from the wounds of the world, from the wounds of time. And so I wonder, especially also in the psychological perspective, when we're thinking of things like so specifically in the lab that I engage with, when we're looking at dyads and the kinds of stories they tell to each other, we're specifically asking for traumatic stories, you see that interpersonal interaction where you don't want to disclose certain types of stories because they're stories you haven't yet realized that you're healing from. And even from the physiological measures we take, we can see this spike where people are kind of lying to themselves. And upon previous reflection of the narrative they're sharing, they rate it differently than when they initially share it, because it's something that they haven't necessarily processed or healed from. And so I wonder then, in this theological perspective, the psychological perspective, and then what you're bringing to the table, Dr. Ortega, how are we healing from these kinds of traumas in our narratives? That again, because I'm also still pushing the idea that narrative is this, like we've seen embodied practice that's not just of the individual, but the individual in and of the world. How do we heal knowing that, again, we might not be able to return, or we might not be able to make it through the abyss?
I have to say, I am not a friend of the notion of healing. I think that in itself, and maybe you can help us with this in terms of what psychologists think about healing, because I find that the notion of healing actually produces the opposite effect, because I think that there will be events in our lives that will always be with us. And I think we just have to hold hands with them as we continue in our journey. And sometimes they will continue to affect us in horrible ways, and we just know how to handle them. But I would not say that. I think that there are some ruptures in life where I don't see the possibility of healing. And I don't even know if I would want it because that event is so much part of what I am and who I am and has forged the kind of person that I am now. And so I don't know if there are visions, of healing that take into consideration healing in a more open way, right? It's like, because if you're always looking for the healing, it's like when you have anxiety and you heal and then boom, it hits you again 3 years later. You're like, oh shit, maybe I haven't healed, so I'm not good. It's. So maybe if there is another notion of healing that's a more open, then I would be more interested in it.
Yeah, this is a Pandora's box.
Yes.
What is the name of the
So,
conference?
first of all, the whole idea of healing, the metaphor is a weird one because, it assumes an illness. And so are psychological problems really illnesses? Oh my God, we can have conference after conference on that. No one's ever resolved it. I think in some ways they are, but in most ways they're not. I basically agree with you that healing is misleading in many cases. I think for trauma and really serious difficulties people have experienced, what you need to do is to come to terms with it in some way. But that's not healing. That's something else. I'm not sure what it is. And then having said all that, I don't want to sound like nihilist or negative in the sense that, psychotherapists, whether they call it healing or whether they call it behavior change, psychotherapists are effective. Therapy is effective, whether you're talking psychoanalytic, client-centered, drug, whatever. What the work that you clinicians do, I'm looking over at you, is God's work, although there may not be a God. and they're just study after study shows the salutary effects. Now, maybe people aren't getting healed, but they're getting better in the sense that their symptoms are being relieved, they're experiencing higher levels of well-being. So, yeah, but the word is really loaded, freighted.
Can I add? I too am a clinical psychologist.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think the word healing within the literature that I've encountered is more along the lines of what you would prefer. Because in the context of what I've spent a lot of time critiquing as the medical model, which a lot of people refer to as the medical model, it really is the sizing up of psychological problems as if they are a medical illness with a diagnosable profile. You've got your symptoms, you've got your presumed underlying malady that is causing these symptoms that we observe. And part of the reason I've been drawn to narrative is that I think it actually extends, human existence and selfhood into the realm of trauma and into the realm of these darker experiences that are painful. I do think certain conceptions of well-being are helpful here. There's one in particular that is eudaimonic well-being, which is different than just kind of like your good or bad feelings of happiness or sadness. It's kind of the ability to find meaning or rise above circumstances, to grow from adversity. And so psychologists, and Dan, you can speak much more to this than I can probably at this point, but it's become very important to consider both of those dimensions of well-being, and I would argue even further, hopefully to start moving towards those in clinical psychology as a way to more reasonably conceptualize like the reality of people's experiences and how they might actually heal through therapy in whatever form of coherence they may be able to find or whatever form of solace that they might be able to find. And I don't know that we always know that in advance when you start therapy out, what's going to come out of the back end. Certainly it's not always like pathology healed, symptoms are now zero, right? It's definitely like a flattening of what we would hope to have. And I think the people with whom I've had the most success are people who I think come away from it with this sense of, okay, like I'm not totally over this, but I can move forward with it now. I can continue to live.
I'm so excited that you brought up this question too, especially in the context of trauma, because the most evidence-based treatment we have currently involves a narrative. Literally, you're asking your client to write out what happened specifically, what they were thinking, what physically was happening to them, what physically their body was experiencing at that time, all wrapped up into a trauma narrative that's written twice and read aloud multiple times across weeks. So it's incredibly hard to do, and the dropout rate is like insane. Like very few people actually finish it because it's so hard when you're contending with every part of that narrative because it was so hurtful and continues to be so hurtful. But at the end, what you're hoping that the client is going to experience is I am reclaiming what the narrative was because I am saying it as to how I experienced it rather than how someone else did it to me. And in addition to that, saying with what we're talking about with healing of like, I'm not cured, there's no cure, but I know what happened to me and I can speak on it because part of what the symptoms, at least how we understand it, is avoidance of thinking about it and avoidance of talking about it and creating that narrative. So it's opening the space within therapy to allow that narrative to come through and for someone to reclaim and re-own it.
I find that so interesting because I'm actually on the camp that you don't necessarily heal, especially about the wound of the border. And so I find the dropout rate, like I think it's interesting because specifically if we do have this attempt to reclaim narrative that are shared narratives or narratives that a lot of people have that simultaneously are also involved in history or involved in contemporary violences, and how do you do that? So in the cases of police violence, how do you reclaim a narrative when you know you're not safe from its continuance? Right. Specifically, you're still actively living it. So actually, I agree with you. It's a loaded question because when people think of healing, so I also wanted to hear your perspective as well from the theological side, because I think sometimes there might be that different idea of how you can like come to God or come to like faith, and that might act to like facilitate healing. But I do think like it's much more difficult and loaded. Because how do you heal from active wounds, from ones that are very much still bleeding? And should you actually want them to close? But yeah, that's super interesting. I did not know that.
I would just add that last week I was teaching a class on atheism, and we were discussing how one of the problems with reforming prison systems, especially in this country, the author was making the argument that religion plays a significant role in people's imagination of you do wrong, you get punished. That's what God does, therefore we should do that too. And so trying to rehabilitate people is very difficult when a general consensus culturally in a given context is that punishment's the way to go.
They only read in the Old Testament.
No, sadly not. I say that because I think in theology it's difficult. You encounter lots of magical thinking, and it's hard sometimes for people to sift out where that takes place and what that looks like. So for some people, healing takes on a magical resonance of it heals everything, and you're completely, again, it's sovereign thought, but like it heals everything, and you're back to your pure original state, which links with notions of baptism, the removal of sin. Now I'm living a clean, pure life in a way that will never be tarnished. But that becomes an impossibility. It's a magical thinking. But I would say that maybe that language of healing that people still use very frequently, right? In certain religious contexts, certainly in Christianity, certainly in this country. I think it leads to this impression that you're probably pushing back against in some way that healing is not this magical thing. That's not how it really works. But for a lot of people, certainly in a theological context, it's always been a magical idea. Maybe that's helpful for some people, and they do claim to be healed of things they struggle with, but it can also be very, very deceptive. I think of all the people I've known who were healed of their false sexual temptations, they went to conversion therapy and they healed them, and then, no, that wasn't good, it didn't work, it was hurtful and harmful. But the language of healing, of something that seemed to be disordered, it's still very much a part of Christianity, certainly. That's one of the reasons I spend most of my time, debunking things. It's a big part of what I think theology is about. But then again, to invoke the idea of theology needs to be a self-reflexive, self-critical exercise. It's like you're speaking to the wall. I mean, that's a really hard thing in this field.
But in Muslim traditions, the idea of ijtihad is like extremely prominent depending on what school you're in.
The idea of what?
Ijtihad? the idea like of self-reflection in text. So you don't just take the sunnah as they are. You don't take the word of the prophet as they are. You have to come to know them. Fundamentalists don't believe that, but they are like there's a lot of scholarship in Islam that's very friendly to that.
Oh, totally. And there's parts of the Christian tradition that begin and end with like the very first thing to do is to confess, to say where you're off, to point out your failures and to be able to identify them. But then the reality becomes, but I still want to use the divine idea to justify what it is I want to do. And so there's different ways to view it. There's different traditions you can draw from in this sense, but it's really hard to separate those things from, or they just ignore one and take up another and don't realize they're different. It's very hard. It's like I knew a minister one time who worked in that charismatic church, and he said, I'm really frustrated because, and I'm not saying I don't share his view on this, but he was like, I'm really frustrated because we practice speaking in tongues in our church. And he's like, but there's zero theology or accountability or teaching that if someone with a mental disorder comes in and is like needing help and they think they're speaking tongues, but it's really an issue, it's a psychological problem, there's nothing we can say to them or do to help them. And you end up thinking, this is really a strange ground to be in a church, right? Like, where can you provide critical insight to help someone who might be struggling when you're engaging in perhaps magical thinking in other ways? And it's a very difficult situation to resolve.
I did have a question.
Long time ago.
But I feel like kind of what we've been discussing about suffering is kind of like, it ties right into that. But I'm going to try and make it relevant again. Dr. Ortega, you had mentioned over lunch, I think the name was Charlotte Delville.
Delville.
And she was a survivor of the Holocaust, but she described her life as like, it ended in Auschwitz. And that kind of resonated with what you were talking about, like not being a fan of healing. But I was thinking, I don't know if I have this title right, but last year, when you were in Dr. Choi's course, we had an article on a sense of foreshortened future, I think is the name of the article. But it was about people who have suffered extreme trauma. Some of them have been like prisoners of war or something like you're in a concentration camp. And they have a sense that their life stopped then. And I always, in thinking about like narrative identity, is that we've discussed this, is like to the degree sometimes we overreach in trying to achieve coherence and unity, and that's always a problem. But then I could see how if you cannot move on at all, that's also a problem. But this is something that forces us, experiences like Charlotte Delville's, force us to recognize like the depth of suffering that people can experience that, you know, a narrative can't really, you can't just accomplish something through the narrative. But I just kind of was, and I mean, I feel like we've discussed this a bit already, but just to the degree to which like suffering kind of shapes our narrative and gives a real reference sometimes to what we're talking about, even if we can only get at it indirectly. And I don't know if anybody wants to speak to this.
Yeah, I was thinking of Susan Bryson's work when she talks about her own experience of sexual trauma. And she's interested in the notion of identity and what happens to the self after extreme trauma. So in her book, she talks about people who were Holocaust survivors, concentration camp survivors, people who have had extreme violence and that feel that they can never be the same, in that, or rather, that they're no longer there. And so what is it that allows them to continue? In fact, we know, I was reading once that a number of people that survived, actually, concentration camps, later took their own lives. And I think it's, in many ways, there will be some experiences that mean that you can never be the same ever, or that you were completely ruptured. And so the question is how to move on. And interestingly enough, she talks about the self as being embodied and also relational. And for her, it is the telling the story of the trauma. And I think those of you who are doing clinical psychology will be interested in this. It is the telling of the story that's important for not healing. I don't think she believes in healing either, but to be able to continue, because she feels she has left herself, it's like left it behind. And so what's coming? But she says it's not only the telling of the story, but also having a sympathetic listener. Because we've been talking about how we tell the stories, but think about survivors of sexual trauma, and when they tell the stories and people say, "Oh, what were you wearing?" Immediately, you will not tell your story. You will not want to continue to tell that story. And so in her account, it's not only the telling of the story, but having the right ears, right? Having people that will actually listen to you. And also people who will not simply say, just get over it. In her own experience, she went back, she's a philosopher, and she went back to the philosophy department. She was an expert on identity, and philosophers kept telling her, well, you'll get over it. You'll get over it. Don't worry about it. Again, you'll heal from it and move on. That's going to be something that's past. And the point is, sometimes it's not past. It can never be past. And so how do you move on from that? And in her account is the telling of story and having the sympathetic listener. And she also actually adds the idea of autonomy, but in the sense that when she had this experience, she could no longer feel that she could go on, take a walk or go outside at night on her own. And it was through her friends. They helped her to little by little help her to go out and trust the world again. And so that in the end, the self is not alone, cannot deal with this kind of trauma by himself, by one's own. That you have to have a community basically that will listen to you. You writing, being able to tell the story, others listening, and others also physically helping you walk outside when you couldn't walk outside again. And so I find her book is called Aftermath, and it's really quite an important book, I think, because it puts together things in philosophy that don't go together. And it's the idea of the self as embodied, as relational, and as having autonomy. And those three usually are not necessarily connected, right? Because autonomy, again, right, leads to this idea of not needing anybody else. Or giving loss to yourself, right?
On that note, awesome. Join me in thanking our wonderful speakers.
So thank you so much for coming. Tomorrow we have sort of a smaller session with Dr. Ortega's work here at 9, from 9 to 1. So if you're interested in that, here in detail for work. It was really a pleasure, and thank you.